All right, everyone, let's grab a Bible and turn to the book of Judges. We are going to be in Judges today. Thankful for everyone that's here. I'm thankful for our visitors. We have some new faces, and I'm excited that you are with us, and we're excited to get to know you a little better. And just thankful for all the men that have helped us worship so far this afternoon. I love George, and I loved his message this morning, that we are in a war, and we have a weapon, and we need to know how to use it. We need to know how to use the Word of God. And I appreciate that so much. And looking forward to the rest of those lessons. And before we get into ours today, I do want to do just a little bit of a promo, Lord willing. And hopefully the pregnancy not getting in the way at all. For the rest of this month, I plan on doing some lessons out of the book of Habakkuk. Because I think Habakkuk asked God some questions that maybe we have asked before and maybe we've been asking more so as of late. And I think that prophet is going to help us with that, to find some perspective and to find some comfort. And so that's our plan going forward. But for today, we're in Judges. I thought becoming a preacher, I would be immune to the tactic of hazing, picking on the new guy, picking on the rookie preacher. Apparently that's not the case. I think asking someone to preach on the book of Judges is kind of like asking them to take out the trash. You know it needs to be done, but you don't really want to do it. You've heard the expression that you're in a dark tunnel and there's just a little light at the end. That's not the book of Judges. The book of Judges is a dark tunnel with more dark tunnel at the end. And you just have to trust that there'll be a light somewhere, someday, because somebody said that there would be. Of course, I'm kidding. I could not be more excited to talk about the book of Judges this morning and to look at God's faithfulness in this book. We've been preaching this year, our theme, that God is a faithful God. And today we're looking at how He's faithful even in the book of Judges. But I don't want us to miss the fact that this book is not sunshine and rainbows. It is not touchy-feely. It is not all bright and light. There's a lot of darkness here. In fact, the book begins, this light-hearted book, begins with a funeral. It begins with somebody dying, a death of Joshua. And it also begins with the people having a lot of enemies around them. The Canaanites are still in the land. And so we start with the death of the good guy, and we have the life of a lot of bad guys. But as you begin to read in Judges chapter 1, it actually seems like things are going pretty well for a while. Because the people are continuing the conquest, they're driving out the Canaanites, and everything is going just like it should until you get to verse 19. And the Lord was with Judah, and he took possession of the hill country, but he could not drive out the inhabitants of the plain, because they had chariots of iron. And now we are feeling a little confused and a little concerned. God is with Judah, and the problem is that they have iron chariots, the enemies that they're going against. Wait a second, are iron chariots too strong for God now? They weren't a problem for Joshua. What's going on with the tribe of Judah? And all of a sudden, the veneer of this conquest is starting to crack. And then you begin to continue to read in verse 20. And Hebron was given to Caleb and Moses, as Moses had said, and he drove out from it the three sons of Anak. But the people of Benjamin did not drive out the Jebusites who lived in Jerusalem. So the Jebusites have lived with the people of Benjamin in Jerusalem to this day. And at this point, the repeated phrase continues throughout the chapter that they did not drive them out. Manasseh, Naphtali, Zebulun, Asher did not drive out the people. And the great conquest of Canaan that looks so good in the last book that we looked at in Joshua now can be summed up in essentially one word, which sums up the entire book: failure. This book of Judges is about the absolute failure of the Israelites. It's a story about how this nation that has been fought so hard for by this God that has been faithful, this God that was willing to rip them out of Egypt, to take them through the Red Sea, to teach them His ways, to carry them and protect them all the way to get them to Canaan so they could drive out the evil of Canaan. Now instead they are starting to look like the Canaanites. Some have said that the book of Judges is the Canaanization of Israel. And God had warned them time and time again, don't leave the people there because they will influence you. And it turns out God was right. And by the time you get to the end of this book, it gets really, really ugly. This book is a tragedy because it ends in absolute chaos and absolute failure. So why is it in our Bible? I kind of like the books that come before it and after it. Give me more of Joshua, give me a little bit more of Ruth. Why are we in Judges today? Why is it in my Bible? It serves as a warning to us. The question has been asked throughout history, what are men capable of doing? If we really got our heads together, if we all started thinking alike and we had all the resources, what are we capable of doing? As of late, there's another part to that question. What could man really do if we got this silly idea of a God out of the way? We don't have to wonder about the answer to that. The book of Judges gives it to us. Men are capable of doing absolutely terrible things and making an absolute mess of things. And so let's start there. What were the failures of Israel that we find in the story? It begins with the failure of a generation. Because as we said, you start the book out, and again, they fail to drive out the people. Some we will read, it'll say essentially they weren't strong enough, which just means they didn't want to. Others will read that they didn't drive them out, but they made them slaves, forced laborers, which means they just didn't want to drive them out. Others actually didn't drive them out at all. They were driven back, which just means they didn't want to drive them out. They lost their drive. They stopped fighting for the conquest that God had given them. And a generation started to just partially obey God, which isn't obedience at all. If Dad asks you to take out the trash and there's 4 bags and you take out 3, you don't get a pat on the back, you get a whooping. And so Israel is no longer obeying this God. And because of that, we read in Judges chapter 2, verse 10, "And all that generation also were gathered to their fathers, and there arose another generation after them, who did not know the Lord, or the work he had done for Israel. Joshua dies, those his age die off as well. And after God has done all of this for Israel, they were slaves, and he's made them into a nation. How many generations did it take to completely forget him? Just one." And then you continue to read in verse 11. "And the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baals, and they abandoned the Lord, the God of their fathers, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt. They went after other gods from among the gods of the peoples who were around them, and they bowed down to them. And they provoked the Lord to anger." The Israelites decided to live with the Canaanites, and because of that, they started living like the Canaanites. They started tolerating the evil that God was asking them to remove. There is something our culture has fallen in love with today, it seems like, and it's actually the same disease that is killing Israel in this book. Tolerance. It doesn't matter what you believe, it doesn't matter how strongly you believe it. Just go along to get along, let's coexist, tolerate everything. That's the virtue of the day, as we're told. And sometimes our culture asks us to tolerate things that kill us. And if you live around and are hanging around evil influence long enough, you will become like it. That's what this book teaches us. Israel's like this surgeon that doesn't cut out all the cancer. Because after all, cancer has a right to grow as well, doesn't it? And all of that started with one generation that was tolerant and became content. But it doesn't stop there. There's also the failure of the judges. There's this judges cycle that pops up because the people were tolerant, because they were disobedient, because these other nations are still in the land. God ends up letting those nations take over Israel. He rises up one of these peoples to oppress Israel for a while. And this isn't impulsive. This isn't a knee-jerk reaction. No, this is actually promised. In Judges 2, verse 15, we read, "Whenever they marched out, the hand of the Lord was against them for harm, as the Lord had warned, and as the Lord had sworn to them, and they were in terrible distress." God had made a promise a long time ago to a man named Abraham back in Genesis 12. And he said, "Those that bless you, I will bless, but those that dishonor you." And what he was saying was, even your own people, Abraham, I will curse. And God is simply being faithful to his promises. But once that happened, once the enemy nation takes over Israel, God doesn't just let them fend for themselves and he's hands off at that point, just let them be wiped out. No, it starts a cycle, because then the people will see this oppression, they will repent, they will cry out to God, and God will send them a judge, the namesake of the book. And the judge comes, and he comes to deliver the people, to save them, to kill the oppressor, to drive them out. But then as soon as that happens, and the people have peace once again, they just fall right back into the cycle that they were before. It's kind of like a slinky that you stretch it out. Because Israel, they're not just going in a circle in a cycle, they're going down each time. It gets worse and worse and worse. They're saved by a judge, but they end up being worse off than they were before the judge came. But this is what I want us to see in this book. That's not just a cycle for the people. That's also a cycle that the judges follow. Because we tend to think, wait a second, Jantsen, the judges are the highlight of the book, right? Didn't we just read in verse 17 that the people were the issue? They didn't listen to their judges. Yes, that's true. And some of the judges have redeemable qualities at times. Elsewhere in our New Testament, they will be commended for their faith, some of them. But actually, the real way that the judges are a highlight in this book is that they're highlighting that there's a need for something more. There's a need for something more. You start out with Othniel, and he's the golden boy. He's from the tribe of Judah. He's the nephew of Caleb, and all you read about him is winning the fights, and he saves Israel, and everything's great. But then he dies, and the people go right back into doing what they did before. And so what we find in this book is that, yeah, the judges can win battles on the battlefield, but they can't win the battle in the hearts of the Israelites, where the real war is. It's like they're taking the paddles and they're shocking Israel, and they're keeping them from coding, they're keeping them from flatlining. But the whole way through this book, Israel's health is declining, and they're getting worse, and they're growing sick. And the same thing happens to the judges. Who's the last judge? Samson. Is he a golden boy? No, hateful and lustful and vengeful and violent. You see the same cycle that happened to the people? God was picking leaders from those people. And so it's a story of failure of a generation. It's also a story of the failure of these judges. Maybe a better title for the book, instead of judges, would be deliverers, because that's what they do. These men were sent to deliver Israel. But when we get to the end of this book, Israel is not delivered at all. They're worse off than they were at the beginning. But there's also a failure of the nation as a whole, because in the last 5 chapters, there is a repeated phrase that holds together the final section of the book, and the phrase is this: in those days, there was no king. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. In fact, that's how the book ends. It's not a happy ending. The last 5 chapters show us a process of the nation sliding into total chaos, but it's also interesting because it tells us how it happens. And it starts with an individual. And that's what we see in the story when we read the story of a guy named Micah in chapter 17. Because Micah decides to make an idol. He decides to serve and worship another god. But then after that, there's a Levite priest that comes his way, and he ends up hiring this Levite priest to be over him and his whole family. It started with an individual, now it's spread to a family, but it doesn't stop there. Then the tribe of Dan wants to make a name for themselves, and they come by and they steal Micah's idol, they steal his priest, and they go wipe out the completely innocent city of Laish. Wipe it out, kill them all, rebuild it, name it after themselves. And the last thing we read about the tribe of Dan is that they set up the idol that Micah had made. It started with an individual, it moved to a family, now it's a whole tribe, but we're not done yet. Because after that story, for the last 3 chapters, we start reading about another Levite. And he is absolutely horrifying. A man that should have been a spiritual leader for Israel. A man that God's people should have looked up to imitate. We read that this Levite had a concubine, essentially a second-rate wife. And he's traveling with her. And they come to the place where they're trying to go, but it's kind of getting dark, and they're close by Jerusalem. Now, at this time, Jerusalem wasn't taken by the Israelites yet. It was Gentiles that occupied it. And so this pious Levite won't stay in Jerusalem. No, let's move on to some of our own people. And so they settle in the town of Gibeah, which is occupied by Benjamites, God's people, this guy's own people. And they come to the town at night, and they stay in the square, and it's the first shocking thing that happens in the story, the first big surprise. They're in the town, they're waiting for someone to take them in, but nobody does. And we're Americans in 2025, and that just kind of fell flat. Because you're thinking if there was a stranger outside holding a donkey and 2 servants, I probably wouldn't let them in either. But the Middle East, in this time, and even during our time, has a different idea of hospitality. You can read of stories, even during our lifetime, where families in the Middle East took in American soldiers they had met that week and were willing to let their families be shot and killed instead of giving up their guest that was an American soldier. Why? Hospitality. It's the same type of situation here. And so this Levite is in a town of Benjamites, and nobody lifts a finger until a stranger comes along. He comes out of the hills, and he's walking through, and he sees him, and he says, hey, you can stay with me. And so he goes into this master's house, and then the people of the town show up. But they're beating on the door, and they're asking to do unnatural, unspeakable things with the Levite. And we get to this point in the story, and now we're absolutely terrified at what the people of God can do when they forget their God. But there's still no light at the end of the tunnel yet. Because the men are beating at the door, and what is offered to them is, hey, just take my daughter, the guy that owns the house. The Levite says, take my concubine, just take the women. If that sounds familiar, your spidey senses are tingling for a reason. This is a mirror image of what happens in Sodom and Gomorrah. More on that later. But they offer up the women, but the men will not take it. They refuse. They said, no, we want the Levite. And so eventually what happens is the Levite grabs his wife, and he throws her out the door to save his own hide. And they abuse her all night until daybreak. And all she can do is just crawl back to the door, grasping for life. And next what the text tells us is that the Levite rises up in the morning just to get up and go on his way. Like he totally forgot about she ever existed. In fact, he would have totally forgotten about her, except he almost trips over her as he goes out the door. And he sees her, and does he weep? Does he feel remorse? Does he try to help her up? No, he looks down at her, and he says, get up, let's be going. But she doesn't answer, because she's dead. And so he picks her up, and he takes her back to his home, and he divides her body into 12 pieces, and he sends those out to every tribe of Israel. And then we read this in Judges 19, verse 30, and all who saw it said, such a thing has never happened or been seen from the day that the people of Israel came up out of the land of Egypt until this day. Consider it, take counsel, and speak. And now we're asking, how did we ever get here? The answer, it started with one man, with Micah, who decided to make an idol. And it spread to a family, and to a tribe, and now to multiple tribes, but we're still not done yet. Because the aftermath of this is actually an entire civil war with the whole nation of Israel. They decide to fight against their brothers of the Benjamite clan, of the Benjamite tribe. And at the end of that, after thousands of men die, only 600 Benjamites are left. And further than that, the other Israelites say, we are completely done with Benjamin. We're not going to give them any of our wives so they can continue to grow. Essentially, they were saying, we want them to die out. We don't let them go extinct. But then later on, they actually have a change of heart. They say, wait a second, no, they are our brothers. We need to keep them around. And what's their solution to this problem that has come up because of sexual abuse and because of death and violence and killing? Here's their solution. Let's go kill other Israelites, some of our other brothers, and take some of their wives. And they got 400 that way. But we still need 200. How are we going to get those? Let's steal them from Gentiles. And so the solution to sexual abuse and violence is more sexual abuse and more violence. And the picture of the end of this book is that the nation is in total chaos. And it ends with the repeated phrase, in those days there was no king. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. How does a nation dissolve into chaos? It starts with one man deciding not to serve the God of Israel. It started at the beginning of the book fighting with Canaanites, but at the end of the book, Israel's fighting themselves. And we see clearly at the end who the real enemy was all along. It wasn't these enemy nations. No, Israel was their own worst enemy. They didn't need to be saved from the Canaanites or the Moabites or the Midianites. They needed to be saved from themselves. It's a dark story, but there is some light in the story. Because Israel is not the only main character. Yes, the nation of Israel is one of them, but there's another main character in the story. And he is much different than the people of Israel. And he has been faithful all along throughout this story. This is a story of the failure of Israel, but it is also a story of the faithfulness of their God, who continued, despite their unfaithfulness, to show them grace and to give them gift after gift. And that begins in the beginning of the story with giving them a home. This story never even would have happened. We wouldn't have the book of Judges if it wasn't for the God of Israel. In the beginning of the book of Judges, we have a nation that are free men and women that are ready. There's a land right before them for the taking. How did they get there? They used to be slaves in Egypt. Nobody knew their name. God delivered them. God kept them. God taught them. God protected them. God fed them and gave them water in the wilderness. God split the Jordan open and let them in the city. God took down the walls of Jericho. God gave them everything they had. It was because of the faithfulness of God. And all along, what did Israel do? They grumbled and they complained, and many times they turned away from their God. But despite their failure, God remained faithful. The most impressive thing that we have seen in this God of Israel this year, as we're looking throughout these books, it hasn't been his power, has it? It's amazing. He created everything. He created the universe in Genesis. But it's not his power. The most impressive thing about this God of Israel, it's his character. It's that he is a faithful God to unfaithful people. George and I didn't try to correlate on our lessons today, but we looked at this text earlier. Paul wrote to Timothy, and he said this, the saying is trustworthy, for if we have died with him, we will also live with him. If we endure, we will also reign with him. If we deny him, he will also deny us. If we are faithless, he remains faithful, for he cannot deny himself. Based on their conduct, Israel never should have even made it to the promised land. But they start there in their home because of a faithful God. But we also see in the middle section of the book that this is a God of second chances. Because we start to see this judge cycle go around, and the people all during it are becoming more unfaithful. But God remains faithful. If it was up to me, I think there might have been 10 chapters in the book of Judges instead of 21. And you read the story, and what does God do when they rebel? Does he just forget about them? Does he just wipe them out? No. He continues to give them second chances. It starts with sending an enemy. Sometimes we read that and we think, okay, God, he's really just fed up with Israel, and he's done, and he got angry, and so he let people oppress them. No, he's putting a speed bump in their way. Actually, every enemy that God gave Israel, it was a gift. That's not God's sign of giving up on Israel. It's the sign of him refusing to give up on Israel, to raise up a nation, to wake them up. Proverbs 3, verse 11 and 12 says, "My son, do not despise the Lord's discipline, or be weary of his reproof. For the Lord reproves him whom he loves, as a father the son in whom he delights." God, because he loved his people, oppressed them. But it didn't end there, did it? Because they would turn, they would repent, they would come to their senses, they would wake up and say, I'm not living the life I should be living. God is trying to show me that. And so he would send them a judge. And he would come to restore them so they would repent. He didn't say, you got yourself into this mess, you can figure it out. Every judge was a gift. But all throughout the cycle, despite them not following any of the judges, God doesn't throw up his hands. He doesn't say, I'm done. I'm not done after the 4th time. I'm not done after the 7th time. I'm not done after the 8th time. There's only 12 judges because it's a picture of Israel. 12 tribes. And so it ends with Samson. But every time, God keeps giving them 2nd and 3rd and 5th and 12th chances because he is a faithful God. And in the last part of this book, we see that God is faithful by giving Israel the gift of a future. It becomes crystal clear when you get to the end, when you read about that civil war that happens with Benjamin, because at the end of the book, Benjamin is hanging by a thread. There's only 600 of them, and it's only men. But God doesn't allow them to be lost. Remember what that story about the Levite and his concubine reminded us of? Sodom and Gomorrah. What happened to those cities? Those people? God completely wiped them out. He destroyed them totally. And Benjamin looks just like Sodom and Gomorrah. So why not them? The people in Isaiah's day were not so different. And I think Isaiah knew. He says in Isaiah 1:9, if the Lord of hosts had not left us a few survivors, we should have been like Sodom and become like Gomorrah. And the message of Isaiah is the only reason you are not like them is because God made promises. He made promises with a man named Abraham. And he made promises to a man named Moses. And he made promises to this nation of Israel. He makes promises and he stands by them. Why do we have hope in this world, Christian? When it gets dark and when it gets evil. Because God made a promise to us. And he's faithful. And so what does all of that mean for us? This story of man's failure and of God's faithfulness? We look at God in the story and we see that he's deserving to be followed and that he needs to be followed. He's the deliverer that we actually need. And we look at Israel, and it's not a story where the preacher says, go and do likewise. It's a story where we say we need to avoid those mistakes. And I think when we do that, it leads us to ask two questions. And the first one's this. Are you moving forward? Because this is what Israel failed to do at the beginning. What direction is your life headed in? And the message that is clear in this book is that if we are not moving forward, you are moving backwards. There's no in between. We're either pursuing God or we're pursuing something else. Israel's like walking on a treadmill in this book. As soon as they stop pursuing God and moving forward and doing what he is telling them to do, they immediately start to go backwards. They had great victories. We just got through the book of Joshua last month. They did amazing things in the name of God, but there was still work to do. Christian, you might have had some great victories in the name of the Lord. You might have come to Christ. You might have started attending with the local church and committing your life to that. You might have mended a relationship that you never thought could be mended, and that is good. But there's still work to do. And it only took one generation to start going backwards. One generation to be content, to lose their fire, to lose their passion, to lose sight of the promises and be in danger of losing the promises. Don't let that be you or your generation. Care about God as much as your parents and your grandparents did and build on that. God was wanting Israel to be a light to the nations. That's where this whole thing is going. That's where this whole story is going. He wants Israel to be a light. But the first thing they had to do to be an influence to the world was to get rid of the evil influence in their life. They had to drive out the Canaanites. They had to drive out sin. And we can't be like them and start thinking, okay, I can move forward while there's something kind of hiding in the background. It's under my thumb. I pretty much got it under control. James will say in James chapter 1, verse 21, therefore put away all filthiness and rampant wickedness, and receive with meekness the implanted word, which is able to save your souls. We looked at it this morning. Clear the land. Get rid of all filthiness and all rampant wickedness. Don't flirt with it. Don't say it's not a big deal. Don't say I'm mostly following God and I'm in control of these things. That ends up leading to death in this book. So keep moving forward. But the last question I want to ask this morning is, who is your king? The book ends with the question, or the statement rather. In those days, there was no king. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Do you know why there wasn't a king in Israel? Because there were thousands of them. Everyone was their own king. Everyone decided, I'm going to do things my way. I'm going to do what feels good. And it's not that the consequences are minor. This book shows us exactly where that puts us if God is not on the throne of our life. It might work for a while. It worked for Israel for a while. But there's no vanilla ending to not having God on the throne of your life. You might have a friend that lives down the street, and they might have a nice put-together house, and they might have kids that are well-behaved and a nice-kept yard, But if God is not on the throne of their life, this book is showing us where the end will be, and it is not pretty. And the same goes for us. Is God the king of your life? Is he king of all of it? Is he king over my career choices and my finances? Is he God over and king over my time and my relationships? Or in those categories, am I just doing what's right in my own eyes? And why do we insist at times? Why do I insist at times of being our own king? I think this book answers at least a part of that for us. Why we do that for a time. Because Israel, for a time, they didn't think they needed a Savior. They thought things were going well enough, that they didn't need to be delivered. But the day came when Israel woke up and they realized, I need to be saved, and I need it now. And this is the other thing that the book is showing us, that the thing that they needed to be saved from, it wasn't out there. Christian, you don't need to be saved from a foreign invader. You don't need to be saved from the IRS. You don't need to be saved from a president. You don't need to be saved from your boss or a family member. You need to be saved from yourself. That's what Israel needed. And that means that we need a better deliverer. We need a king that can win the war in our heart. The book of Judges is dark, but it makes Jesus Christ shine so bright. Because he is the king that Israel needed. He is the king that can save us from our own desires that send us into chaos. All the judges, they did their part, but they all died. This king doesn't die. These judges, they did good things at times, but they failed to fully follow the Father. We tell the story about Gideon, and we like to cut it in half, don't we? In fact, that's exactly what we do with our kids. Gideon, he found new courage, and he fought the Midianites in a great victory. End of the story. Did we forget that Gideon ended up, because of his bad temper, killing his own people, Israelites? Do we forget that Gideon, after saying, no, I'm not going to be your king, God is, he names his son, son of the king. He was talking the talk, but not walking the walk. Do we forget that he made an idol, essentially, that led away the nation of Israel? It's all showing us that we need a king that is not faithful sometimes, that doesn't win some victories, that is always faithful. And how can we look at the story of that Levite and his wife and not think that we need a better husband? We need someone that when we are crawling back to the door for life, looking for anybody to help, that we don't have a king that is going to throw us out to save himself, but instead he died himself to save us. This book is dark. It shows us what men are capable of doing, but it shows us how faithful God was to give us the king that we really needed, the deliverer that Israel really needed. And so that's our last question for the day. Is he your king? If he's not, I don't know how else to convince you. The book of Judges does it in one of the most powerful ways that I've realized this week, that if God is not on the throne of your life, it is not going to end where you want it to end. It might be going okay right now, but you need him. You need him to deliver you. And so if he's not, if you need to do something to change that, to make him the Lord of your life, we invite you to do that, and we would love to help you any way we can. Always stand while we sing.